Evening, everyone. Just bear with me. As usual, I've got to do some stuff to YouTube to make it work properly. Um, cool. So, yeah, welcome everyone to this week's live stream. Please do not share personal data in the chat. Just ask questions as if they're about a hypothetical person. So, what if someone was in this situation? What would that happen? What would happen with them? That's the way to ask questions, basically. I'll prioritize questions from the week that are anonymized, and I will delete questions that come in the live stream and get you to rephrase it. No, hang on a minute. Here we go. So what else do I need to say? It's not legal advice. If you are into astronomy, there are northern lights right now, so you probably want to get outside and stick your camera north. I'm in Bedford, which is reasonably far south, and I already see them. The sun's not even probably gone down properly yet. Other bits and pieces from the week. I was just chatting to Karis and Will about this. So I've said before, I've been FOIing every council in the country to find out their average waiting times for people owed the main homelessness duty. So section 193. I've had some more responses. So again, I just kind of put the screen up and you can pause it to have a look to see if your council's on there yet. Some councils don't have, or they can't be bothered to provide the stats, unfortunately, but most do pretty quickly, to be honest. So far, the lowest number I've seen is Ipswich. So Ipswich are saying that on average, single homeless people wait 21 days once the main housing duty is accepted till they get housed. Now that might still be in private rented. Newham is an interesting response saying that basically homeless households don't get social housing, which I was just saying to Will and Karis, might be problematic for them. But yeah, I'm going to keep adding to this every week. So obviously at the end of it all, once I've kind of got as many as possible, I'll publish something somehow. See if Will do it on his website or something so that people can kind of get an idea. The point of this is to give you an idea how long it's going to take. And also, if you're fleeing your area and you don't care where you end up, then you can potentially aim for the councils that have the shortest waiting time. So anyway, that's that. And then bit of the stuff from the LJO this week as well. Let me just try and work out share the right screen. So there's a couple of decisions that are a little bit interesting. So this one here was Liverpool, and it's interesting because let me just get my notes because I just highlighted a couple of paragraphs. So we go into paragraph 7. So just makes this point. This, as I say, this is the first time I've seen this actually. So normally we cannot investigate a complaint until the organisation complained about has had an opportunity to consider and respond to it. However, we may decide to investigate if we consider there are good reasons. In this case, we exercise discretion to investigate the complaint because Miss X told us she was rough sleeping and at ongoing risk of domestic abuse. We decided the urgency of the situation meant we should consider the matter now. So, as I say, seems like if you have got something that's urgent right now, then the LJ won't insist you go through the council's complaints process. And then we go into the actual findings. This one basically is interesting. Where is it? So 23 to 26, the council has a duty to provide interim accommodation while it makes inquiries into what, if any, further duties owed. If the person might be in priority needs. There's something somewhere about. Oh yeah, here we are. So because you might have heard me and Shannon whinge about the kind of rough sleeper outreach teams before. And in this case, the fact the outreach team couldn't find her was then kind of used, oh, well, she can't be homeless then. And actually, the LJ said on balance of probability she was. So, but it's just another example of like rough sleeper teams basically making it harder for homeless people to get help. So you have a look at that again. If you just search for that code on the LJ website or even just Google, probably it'll come up with that. And the other one is Leeds, which again, Leeds, I'm not a big fan of. So this one, again, domestic abuse. Let me just see what paragraphs I was looking at here. So 55 to 61. So again, it's just making the point. So basically, this was somebody been served at section 21, but was also subject to abuse. And this is a good LJO decision to see how low the threshold is for the council having a duty to provide interim accommodation. So basically, because it was making some inquiries, that's the end of the argument because that showed that there was reason to believe that they might be at risk of domestic abuse. And then again, you kind of see, I'm not going to go into the kind of nitty gritty of it, but yeah, basically she got whatever it was, £600 in all. So again, it was because basically there was a different outcome. So the LGO couldn't say whether the failure had led to her not being housed long term because she got housed in a different way, I think. But again, it's just kind of have a look at that. So again, go to the top and have a look at the code if you want to see that in a bit more detail. Right, so let's get to the questions from the week first, and then we will get on to the ones from the live stream. So cool, you're right, AANs and HDC. Yeah, you right, Cheeseface. Yeah, we've got one quick. Let me get the screen. There we go. So here's our little virtual flip chart, and here is the first question. Now, again, me, Will, and Karis couldn't remember if we asked this last week. I should have brought this to the live stream last week, but I don't think I actually did. But if anyone can remember us better than we can, let us know, so we won't repeat it. But it's a good question. So, how would you recommend proceeding with a complaint if the council concerned may retaliate in the short term? For example, deliberately rejecting discretionary matters, destabilising temporary housing through legal means, stonewalling, unhelpful behaviour, etc. So, very good question. We've kind of talked about this a little bit before on the channel. So I can only talk about my own experience, I guess. But when I worked for Bedford Borough Council, there was absolutely retaliatory action against people who kind of, were sort of being a fly in the ointment. And they would essentially do that by ensuring that the person ended up in the worst possible legal discharge of the duty. So it'd be like one of the hard to let properties in one of the slum tower blocks in the town or something. And that's kind of legal in the sense that they were legal, they were legally suitable. It wasn't legal to obviously target someone. But it certainly does happen. Bottom line is housing officers have a lot of power, very little accountability, and so you tend to have some pretty horrible behaviours going on. If you think about the post office investigation team, you probably get a reasonable idea of how some housing officers operate. So it's a real problem. I actually don't really know what you can do about it to really kind of ensure that there's no retaliatory action. You can do subject access requests, which is a really good way of holding councils to account in general, but that's relying on the fact that council's recording that they're doing something naughty, and they won't always. They do sometimes, but they won't always. So yeah, that's kind of why I've said before, like when I worked at Just Us, we'd wait till the person was housed most of the time to actually wait to make the complaint, because then they were housed, so it's all right. Unless there was some kind of urgency that we needed to get a quicker outcome. So we were aware of that kind of practice happening. But for Karis and Will, I don't know if you've got anything to add to my answer there. My answer is not very helpful, really, is it? But it's a really good question. But yeah, anything else that can be done, do you think? I mean, I guess basically being polite and kind of keeping everything in writing is probably the best you can do. And not kind of antagonizing things more than you need to. But sometimes you do have to push back on the housing officers to get your kind of rights, to enjoy your rights. So it's something you need to think through carefully, really. But yeah, you've gone, Karis.
Sorry. And I would just say keep accurate records of what's happening and when. And if you do put in a complaint, when you put in the complaint and what happens after that and what date.
Yeah.
Most up-to-date records you can keep. But like you said, just be polite and try and do it after.
Yeah. I mean, so it's legal to covertly record housing officers and keep and store it yourself. You can't then share it around unless there's, kind of down the line the investigating, the LGO needs it or something like that. But again, like when I saw it from the kind of the other side, housing officers would basically be like kind of like gathering around a computer and kind of working out how they could stuff someone up almost. That's kind of how it was. So you're obviously not going to see that from the outside. So yeah, cool. Right. So that's the first question. Second question is a bit of a long one, but it's a good one. But it's quite long, quite a lot of stuff going on here. So it's worth kind of going into a bit of detail. So a friend of mine lives with his wife and 3 kids and lives in private rented house. Landlord increased the rent back in February with Section 13, which was unaffordable to sustain. He continued to pay the original rent, but is now in arrears as the increase in rent has accumulated. Section 21 has now been served. He has already an account with the local council, but is worried that because him and his wife work and earn above national average wage, but not enough for the high rent in the location they live in, but the council will not give him the homeless priority needs to get points needed for a social house. He has checked the housing priority guidance for Stockport, well done, and they do not currently have a maximum wage limit for people they would give priority points. So we then got 3 questions. In fact, let me just kind of separate this out a little bit so we can see them better. Oh, it's going to do that now, isn't it? There we go. This will be all right. So firstly, this is really helpful, by the way, to put questions like this to kind of separate out the different issues. So firstly, what are the chances that after Section 21 an eviction notice and after the duty period that they push him into private accommodation? So good question. Part of the answer is we don't know. How long's a piece of string? But there is also some stuff we can say about this. So if we go back into the situation, there's some confusion here, which is understandable because councils are confusing. That priority need points and priority need are 2 different things, and in fact, probably technically the kind of the allocation policy might say priority points and then priority need is a different thing entirely. Now, this person has 3 kids. We're going to assume they're dependent, so they are automatically in priority need for the purpose of the homeless application. So, oh, this is such a horrible one to unpick. This person has already applied to the housing register under Part 6 of the Housing Act and has probably been given a banding, but now they're being evicted, or the eviction process has started, and therefore they might be homeless pretty soon if they're not already. Sounds like they're threatened with homelessness at this point in time. Now, what that should mean is the council should really accept that as a homeless application now, engage with the prevention duty. But ultimately, if that prevention duty is not successful and their family do end up homeless, then they'll be legally homeless, owed the relief duty. They'll be owed the Section 188 interim accommodation duty, assuming they've got recourse to public funds, which I would have thought they do. And so then they're probably going to be owed the main housing duty unless the council houses them first in the relief period with a final accommodation offer, which would be a 6-month assured short hold tenancy, or a final Part 6 offer in that period as well. So that if you're confused by this, it's not just you, it's ridiculous. So the bottom, so I guess what I'm trying to say here is that no matter what happens, there is no situation when you're guaranteed social housing. The closest you get to a guarantee is when you've got significant mobility issues, and therefore social housing is more likely to be suitable because it's much easier to adapt social housing properties than it is private. So basically that's kind of the answer to the first one. Is it just depends. In fact, if we was Stockport, let me check. Stockport's not on that list. No, I haven't had Stockport's FOI thing back yet. So let's get the right page. There we go. So that's the first bit. Will and Karis, do you want to add anything to this at this point, or am I doing all right so far? Yeah.
I keep going, yeah, and maybe I'll say something at the end.
Yeah, cool. Okay, cool. So right, this is the big one. Secondly, how do they deem what is affordable in terms of rent? Let's come back to that one. So then thirdly, if he does not find affordable accommodation, which is highly likely, what will happen at the end of the duty period? Could he stay in temporary accommodation until he gets social housing? Yes, he could. That's definitely a possibility, very plausible possibility, but it's not guaranteed. So that's basically what happens is, and now a lot of councils, they know full well that certain groups of people just won't be able to find affordable housing. So although they'll tell everyone go and find private rented, go and find something, they know from the off that that's very unlikely to work out. So the social housing becomes this kind of backstop if they can't find private rented themselves. However, they will work with private landlords themselves. They might be able to, they might essentially find a private rented accommodation for you. So that's the third bit. Again, Karis or Will, do you want to say anything about this bit? Because I think we're about to get into a fairly in-depth conversation about affordability. So yeah.
Do you want to say anything about affordability, or do you?
Yeah, well, no. So, no. Just before we get into affordability, do you want to say anything at this point about the about anything else that kind of other things? I guess something I haven't mentioned yet is that some housing allocation schemes will have a limit on earnings or savings. I'm not quite sure what the I can't think of what Bedford's would be in terms of if there's a cap on earnings. But I think if you're a single person and you have more than £30,000 worth of assets, you won't be able to get social housing if you apply for Part 6. But there's actually nothing stopping them still giving you social housing if you went down Part 7, the homeless application route, which is what's happening here. As I say, this is why it's so confusing, because you can apply under Part 6, then become homeless, so you go down Part 7, and ultimately you end up back on Part 6, but under a different kind of cohort of people. So rather than being a general housing needs application cohort, you'll then be a homeless kind of cohort. So I'll probably do a better video about this at some point, just explaining that, probably with some pictures to make it easier. But yeah, shall we get onto affordability then? So affordability is unhelpfully ambiguous at the moment in terms of case law. There was a really nice and clear case back in 2018 called Samuels v Birmingham, which basically said if you have to top up your rent from your kind of living out costs of universal credit, then that's enough. You're basically homeless, because what their argument was, when the Department of Work and Pension work out how much money to give you, they don't give you any extra. Basically, there's nothing in there for housing. What they give you is for your clothing, your travel, all the kind of essentials, the necessities of life, I think they call it. So there was that kind of benchmark, but then there was a few organisations that then did research into kind of working out how much should you be able to pay for different things. AHAS, which closed down about a year ago now, they did some reasonably helpful figures, but that closed down. Housing Reviews Limited now do figures. I can only imagine how unhelpful they'll be, in my opinion. So we kind of left in this kind of ambiguity, because there was then another case called Bapty v Kingston, and I have read it many times and still can't work out what the hell it's saying, because I'm like, well, it's basically almost saying it's just for the housing officer to work it out themselves, but they need to kind of be reasonable. So it then becomes very difficult to challenge, because you're going to have housing officers who say, 30p is enough to feed a family of 5, that kind of thing. So you kind of have to challenge it that way. So that's kind of how it now. If you're I would say if you're both earning, let's assume you're on universal credit as well, my guess is you're going to find that actually under the calculations they're likely to use, you're probably going to be able to afford anything, because universal credit, if you're earning and getting universal credit, is quite generous, relative to people who are just on, just a universal credit, because you get to keep a lot of your earnings, or keep a lot of your universal credit, whichever way around you look at it. So yeah, that's the best I can answer it right now. But Will or Karis, do you want to add to that at all, or take away from that? Because it's just seems to me to be very difficult for a layperson to argue. And I imagine a solicitor would probably have an easier job with it. And I guess the housing officer will need to say why they think a particular amount of money is reasonable. But yeah, more than that, I don't know. Yeah.
Sorry if I seem really quiet. It's just just trying to unravel this, because I mean, in terms of affordability, that tends to come up in two contexts, doesn't it? One is whether something's suitable for somebody. You could try and turn it down and say, I can't afford this. And the other is where you have turned it down, or you left there and they're saying you're intentionally homeless, and you're saying, well, I couldn't afford it. But the reason I mention that is neither of those appears to apply here yet, because what this question seems to be about is about whether you could somehow be barred from the housing register, or it would affect your amount of income, would affect what you were entitled to from the housing register. Am I misreading that? Because there's a maximum wage for people.
Yeah, so I think that fear is an unfounded fear. I think in that kind of on that detail, I don't think that's going to be a problem.
No.
I don't think their earnings is going to bar them necessarily from getting social housing, but you still have the same problem if you're not being able to guarantee it, would be how I would see it.
Yes. So I wasn't going to go into affordability in a lot of detail on this, because just going back and just trying to unravel it, it was going all right until I got to the bit where a Section 21 has now been issued. It's because him and his wife work and earn above the average wage, but not enough for the high rent and the location. I thought that was going to move on to an offer, an out of borough offer, type problem. But that doesn't come up, and it's then about. But my view on this whole problem here is that if they have to leave their private sector place, then the council will have to look into assisting them under Part 7 as a homeless family. And then the answer then to question 1 is that if the council do accept a duty, they can push you into private accommodation in the sense that if they want to discharge their duty by offering something, it wouldn't be a good argument to say, well, I don't want this because I want to wait for a private place. Sorry, for social housing. So they could, in my opinion, they could push you into private accommodation. And then how they deem what's affordable, that goes to the formulas that Mike was talking about in those cases. Because I think which was the first, the Samuels. I think Samuels was the first time they tried to get a universal answer to that question, yeah, rather than each council having some person who had their own notion of affordable. So that if you look at those two cases, there's basically formulas you can try and work with. Then what was that register, Mike? And Cara, sorry, maybe you know. At the time of Samuels, there was a national register which they used as a reference point, and then one of them got closed down, didn't it?
I think that was this. I think that was AHAS that was mentioned in the Samuels case, the
Yeah.
Association of Housing Advice Services.
But there's another one, isn't there? There's a second one that
So there's housing reviews now. So yeah, since January, like housing reviews have been putting figures out, I think, which were low. Yeah, were lower, I think, than the AHAS figures that I last saw. But I mean, I'm just looking at the LHA rates for Stockport to get an idea of how much a 3 or 4 bed property might be, and the LHA rates for 3 bed is £900 basically, and for a 4 bed it's £1,400. Now, if you've got two people earning both, earning, I think I'm guessing they mean above the living wage, because the average wage is like 40k each or something like that. I don't know what the average wage is right now, but that'd be way over the kind of amount of money you need. But my guess is, yeah, I think my answer would probably be overall is that yeah, private rented accommodation somewhere in Stockport will be affordable for a couple who are earning more than minimum wage. So yeah, that as I say, like those LHA rates are much lower than other areas of the country where same minimum wage basically kind of applies. So I think that might have to be the limits of what we can say really in this case. Is that there's nothing this family's going to be able to do to avoid going into private rented accommodation. There's nowhere guaranteeing social housing. But again, we've said it, I think, in about 5 different weeks now that we should do a video dedicated to affordability because it's a massive issue. Karis, did you want to? I know CAB do figures. Well, they certainly used to do figures on affordability and that kind of stuff at some point.
Yeah, so when you do the housing application, they'll go through finances with you and reasonable living expenses. So you'll get like a financial statement with your application, and you'll put in rent, what you income and what benefits you've received, and what your outgoings are. So look into bank, and you'll supply your bank statements. So look at all of that and what they think you can afford. They'll have like formulas on percentage of your income, probably typically about 30-40%. If the rent exceeds that.
Yeah,
That's what I was going to say. But they'll go through all their finances when you apply to the council. And they'll give a breakdown.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I hope there's something that's helpful in there. And for those who are still listening, I hope you kind of followed that. Speaking of which, if you feel like giving the video a like and subscribe, whatever, that'd be awesome. So let's get to the questions of the live stream now then. So this one here, let's get onto it and have a little look what it says. Bear with me whilst I struggle to use Microsoft Word. No, go that way. Yes. Cool. Right. So my friend is in a council house. He's on the tenancy agreement with his wife and kids. They've broken up. How does he go about getting help from the council for all their housing? So you might have heard me say that generally housing law is pretty darn good, with the exception of this one situation, in my opinion. So basically, the case law is very old. It's like 25 years old. So whether it will change anytime soon, I don't know. But essentially, if there's no domestic abuse involved, or or as in this particular friend has not been subject to domestic abuse, then the council's position will be that it's reasonable for them to continue living together, which is ridiculous, but that's what the law kind of is at the moment. The case is called Moncada, which is like 1998 or something. So, so in one sense, that makes it very difficult to get help from the council. You might have to look at really some unpleasant options like trying to work through the supported housing, kind of supported housing route. It doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't try, I guess is probably what I should say. So if you approach the council and explain the situation to them, you might first of all get a decent housing officer says, yeah, I can see that's unreasonable for you, therefore you're homeless, and therefore, you still need to be in priority need. But they might also, for example, have contacts with landlords and be able to get some private rented accommodation fairly quickly in that situation. So it's definitely worth approaching the council, but I think you need to be prepared for a not homeless decision, and you also need to be prepared that it's actually quite difficult to challenge that. So as I say, there would need to be some sort of abuse involved to kind of work that out. So yeah, and just just add to that. So this is also relevant, and this is something that the friend also needs to tell the council. He does also have mental health issues, and it's making him a lot worse living there. So again, this is part and parcel of the kind of question of whether it's reasonable to continue to occupy the accommodation. But it's a high hurdle to kind of cross. It's whereas most thresholds in housing are very low or low. This one's not. This one's quite high. So again, what you'd need to kind of go with is evidence from medical professionals really to kind of say, this is the impact it's having on me. And I think that was kind of a bare minimum, really. Appreciate it shouldn't necessarily be like that, but it is. Pragmatically speaking, you want to go in with some pretty clear evidence that it's having a very serious impact on you. So, yeah, it's saying that as well. The council should also give you some competent advice, alongside that. So it might be a case of saying, well, as I say, there are these supported accommodation options. These are the hostels you might want to move into to get back onto the housing register. So there's some stuff they could tell you, but they probably don't have to house someone. As I say, it's just I don't understand the reasoning for it. But that's what the case said, and that's what councils can therefore do. So yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Karis or Will, or know any better than me, but I think that's I'm pretty sure that's the position the council will take. Are you on mute, Will?
I was looking at it from a slightly different angle. I'm thinking if they have broken up, and they're no longer together, and then one of them needs to apply to the council, what do you need to do? Maybe I was missing that, but just as a hypothetical, the council would only house one of them if they've either got the children living with them more than half the week, or if they have some other reason for being vulnerable. But of course, that would include having left home because of domestic abuse now. And the thing I was just looking up the definition of abuse, because I know this sounds silly, but domestic abuse is much more widely defined now. And it's almost true to say that many relationships in the process of breakdown might go through phases where one of the parties is behaving in a manner which could be described as abusive. And that's, in a normal sense of the word, you could say abusive. He made abusive comments. That you may say, well, that's not what it means. That's not abuse. That's just being saying something nasty. Or sort of so and so was subjected to abuse outside court or something. But what I'm thinking there is that it might mean that people. I mean, I had a case a couple of years ago where I thought I was sort of taking the mickey, but it seemed to work. I was acting for a man or assisting a man whose wife wanted to split up with him and was behaving very badly towards him. She hadn't been violent, but she was, saying horrible things to the kids about him, and also she was trying to get the landlord to serve a notice to quit on them and then get them both out and she could stay. It was unpleasant stuff, and he was suffering quite a lot of sort of distress as a result of it. And I did run the argument. I told him to apply to the council and say he was in priority. He was homeless because he couldn't live where he was because his wife was making it unbearable for him and subject him to abuse. He was in priority need because of the abuse, and it was unintentionally had a local connection. And I didn't quite figure out what happened in the end, but I think they did actually pick him up and house him. I mean, they never actually issued a negative decision, and I think they found him somewhere, and he was happy. So there is a lot more you can do now with a breakdown of a relationship, because do you know what I mean? I mean, I don't want to sort of trivialize the concept, but I mean, we've all been in relationships which, well, maybe we haven't, maybe you guys haven't, but relationships which break down. And in the course of that, people say things which they later feel a bit bad about, or do things. And the other person might say, well, that is abusive, and somebody else might agree with them. So what I'm saying is it's a fairly low threshold. I mean, it doesn't have to be violent. So you could, if the relationship is broken down in a fairly, not dramatic manner, which is quite common, then you might be able to get priority need because of that. Do you disagree with me, you two? I mean,
I think
I'm sticking
I
my
think
neck out.
yeah, no. So I think so because when the DA Act came in, I read a lot of stuff just trying to work out, okay, at what point does a dysfunctional relationship become abusive? And effectively, I
Yeah.
mean, Jan Luber says it quite well. He says domestic abuse is kind of the thresholds crossed when one party becomes a threat to another. And there's elsewhere it talks about there needs to be some harm. Now this person, this situation is kind of talking about a situation where there's obviously it's having an impact on this person's mental health. That could be because there's abuse going on there. It could be, it could be there's no, as I say, there's probably also an element that needs to be intentional as well. So, one party cheating on another, but didn't mean to kind of harm the other party, then that wouldn't count as domestic abuse. So, so that's kind of, I think bottom line is it's absolutely worth trying. I think the threshold at which point is something's classed as domestic abuse is not very well set out. But I think if this person is going to go there and say, look, this is that my ex-partner is being unpleasant, which they probably are, it's having a very significant impact on me. Then I think you're certainly in the ballpark of making of kind of going down that line. And there's nothing, lose anything by doing so. So I think that's it's there's probably some domestic abuse specialists out there who would probably say there's more to it than that. I don't know, in terms of kind of more, in terms of the dynamics and stuff. But yeah, there's no harm in trying for sure. Karis?
I'm sorry, just as on the domestic abuse note, there's a recent LGSO, and there's local government and social care ombudsman in September, resulting from Ealing Council. And I was reading this morning about domestic abuse, and they point out the council had a really archaic view that domestic abuse was limited to physical violence, and they said it's outdated and it really needs to be up to date. So in that terms, they really are looking at domestic abuse, which considers the wider concept of coercive control, financial, alienating children. That's all comes under domestic abuse. And that's something the local ombudsman will look at, as they put in the case. It's a recent case in September.
Yeah. I'll try and dig that out. If it's that recent, then I might be able to find it. But I think I think it's I think it's such a complicated issue. You're going to have housing officers who are going to differ, and there are certainly housing officers who have that kind of archaic view of, oh, he's not actually hit you though, that sort of thing. But yeah, I think it would be I guess another thing the person would be good to do is go and see their doctor and just explain what's going on for them. This person's already saying that it's having an impact on the health. Well, okay, the doctor needs to know about that to provide evidence for that anyway. So I think that's it would be an interesting kind of subject to talk in more detail. Maybe get some experts in on that, because it's tricky dynamics, I guess. But yeah, certainly nothing to lose by trying it. Just for the person I've just deleted their comment, so if you rephrase your question to be a what if question, so the next question is a great example of that, by the way. So let me put this in here. This is what a good what if question is, by the way. So what if someone accepted to be homeless due to domestic abuse, but they won't accept you for permanent housing due to previous rent arrears? It's a great question. It's also a great what if question. So thanks to that person. That's how you need to phrase your questions. This is not an unusual situation. I'm going to tell this story. I'm sorry, I'm going to tell it because I've probably told it several times before. But my old colleague John Allen, who still works for Just Us in Bedford, he had exactly this situation come up where he had a victim of domestic abuse, including financial abuse, who had not ridiculous rent arrears, but it was because of the time she was sharing with her ex-partner who was being a nightmare, but rent arrears had accrued basically, and the Bedford Borough Council had a duty to house her because she was automatically in priority need. But then when Bedford Borough Council tried to refer her to a housing association, because in Bedford they're reliant on housing associations, there is no council stock in Bedford. Every housing association was saying no, she's got rent arrears. And John literally he went in bull in a china shop. He sent a complaint to Stonewater's chief exec, the MP, chief executive council, anyone he could think of, and just said that's a blanket policy that's very clearly unlawful for this exact reason. And Stonewater immediately changed their policy and said, okay, yeah, we're gonna put something in there about having discretion to look into why that person might have rent arrears. So obviously, I don't know which housing association we're talking about here, but it's not an unusual situation. It's the council's problem. The council should really have dealt with this already because it's not an unforeseeable situation. But where you've got the council having a duty to house someone, that duty is a duty, is an absolute duty. They've got to do it. They can do that in social housing, or they could resort to private rented accommodation. But either way, they've got to do it. Now, if you can't run the argument and you haven't got time to run the argument to basically complain about the housing association's policy, then essentially what might happen is you end up in private rented. And that's kind of one of those things which just makes it more likely. Or you could try and set up some kind of repayment plan. Assume this, if this wasn't your fault, then I don't know if I certainly wouldn't set up a repayment plan. To be honest, I just complain about it. But if it's if you're subject to domestic abuse, but the rent arrears were kind of a separate issue, then setting out a repayment plan and committing to it, even if it's kind of quite low repayments, then that's something that can show the housing association that you're serious about clearing the debts or whatever. So one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that the council can just write off the debt, as in they can pay it. So I've seen Bedford pay £5,000 just to write off a debt for this exact reason, because it's cheaper for them to pay the debt than it is to house someone in temporary accommodation for years if private rent is not a realistic option. So so we've lost Karis. I hope she comes back. But Will, would you add anything to this one here? It's a good question.
No, I wouldn't. I was much more conservative with a small c in my initial response to it, because I thought they're two different criteria, aren't they? And you could get through on one and then fall down on the other. But I like the idea of challenging it on basis that it's discrimination or it's a blanket policy. And as you say, they could write off the rent arrears. But it's tricky, isn't it? Because I could see it, if you tried to challenge it legally, you could well fail, because the judge would say, well, there's one rule says this and one rule says that, and they're perfectly legal rules and they've been applied rationally. So I think it would be more a question of making complaints and making a fuss.
But I think that there's also been several kind of cases, or big picture cases, which have been lost because domestic abuse is a gendered issue. It tends to affect females more than males. So there was that Idor case we talked about a year ago, where they had a policy which essentially discriminated against victims of domestic abuse who tended to be female, and they kind of had to rejig their whole policy. So potentially you would actually have some legal kind of footholds, if that's the right word for it, to kind of actually have a bit of a go at them. Say, actually, you know what, this policy is rubbish, or this housing association practice is rubbish and needs to be improved. And I think actually, as in Stonewater's case, they changed immediately, because I think they could see how bad it looked. So There's a question there. So Cheeseface, could you please explain what this means in simple English, please? Which bit, Cheeseface? We'll give it a go, but let us know which bit didn't make sense. We'll try it again. And also just a comment there, it's not illegal to record them if you're in a public space. It's actually it's legal to record them in a private space. So there's a really interesting employment law case called Bourne v. Lewisham from 2013 where it was like, so there's this disciplinary hearing or meeting or something with staff member. So the employee left a recording device in her bag and recorded the whole meeting. That was all admissible in court, so that was all legit. The bit that wasn't legitimate is when she left the room and it kept recording. So you can basically record anything that's in your earshot. If you're there, you can record it. If you're part of that conversation, you can't, obviously go to a bus stop and record someone's private conversation or whatever. I guess you could actually, it's very public there. But yeah, so yeah, but it's distasteful. That's kind of what the judge called it. They kind of don't like people doing it. If I was in this situation, I would definitely do it because I just don't trust a lot of councils, basically. So yeah, so there's just a bit more detail about the that question there, but I'm not sure that changes the answer actually. So what's the difference between that council property and a housing association property? Good question again. So for reasons I don't understand, Will, you might know this because you've been around a lot longer than I have, but in like 1990, a lot of council. That's when. So I talk about what I do know. Bedford Borough Council sold all of its stock to a housing association. I assume because they thought it was in their interest somehow. It's now come back to bite them badly because they've basically got no ability to discharge their duty. They've got to rely on a housing association who doesn't like them very much. So or yeah, certainly doesn't get on with them most of the time, it seems. So it's both a social housing, both will be, long-term tenancies, lower rents than private rented. In theory, the landlord should be less rubbish, but there's plenty of housing associations out there are pretty rubbish. And both can be used as part of this main housing duty. More than that, I don't really know, other than the fact it's a separate company, separate organisation that you're having to deal with. The main one in Bedford is actually pretty good in my experience. BPHA, pretty nice. Seems experience of them has been pretty good, but I know that's obviously kind of just one. So yeah, well, what else? What else is different?
Well, I mean, I guess the primary difference is just historical ones about the way they've evolved, really. Because they're back in the sort of 80s or before that, there was a lot of council housing, and housing associations tended to grow up as sort of charities or sort of quite progressive organisations that mirrored councils but didn't have any statutory duties. And then over time, housing associations have tended to become I think, a bit more negative in the sense that they have become quite big. A lot of them have merged and formed these sort of, I hate to use the word Death Star, but that's sometimes how it feels when dealing with organisations like London Quadrant and
Peabody.
Poplar Harker. It's just sort of, you can't get through to anyone on the phone. The idea of a housing officer is long gone. They're worse in a way than local authority because with local authority, you've got political accountability, whereas you don't have a sort of housing association councillor or meeting you can go to. Well, you might do, but it's probably less accessible. But then in the old days, there used to be the housing association tenancy. Now, this is going back a bit. In the 80s, I think they would rent under, it wouldn't be a secure tenancy because I suppose it could be a rent act tenancy. But now what used to happen was that housing associations would not rent under assured short-hold tenancies. And it was considered very bad practice. But then that sort of changed, and then that became more acceptable. So, I mean, I would say that housing associations I tend to see them as a form of private landlord, but a more generous and deep-pocketed form of private landlord than the sort of person that's renting a flat above a high street shop or something where it's difficult to get them to do repairs and things. But that, I mean, I think the council tenancy is still the best kind of tenancy to have. So I'd see them as a sort of a grade really, with the housing association in the middle. But beyond that, I can't have much to add.
Yeah, cool. Welcome back, Karis. We lost you there for a bit.
Yeah, hello,
Sorry.
can't see you.
So
Oh,
last question we've got for at the moment anyway, and because the Northern Lights are on, I'm going to string this one out at all. If in temporary accommodation, can a person be added? Yeah, provided it's reasonable. Certainly, if you marry, yeah, 100%. There's the council can't prevent you living with your kind of your family. So yeah, I think you just basically it's just a case of just telling them. It might, of course, change. It might have an impact on the homeless application in theory. Probably quite unlikely in practice, but in theory, it might change the dynamics of kind of priority need potentially. Let's say, for example, because on their own the person's vulnerable, but with the help of their wife, they're not vulnerable. Kind of that sort of idea. Not quite sure what else it might kick in that might make a difference. But yeah, absolutely. I don't know that there'd be any, because it's certainly in a situation where you've got a married couple. It's not going to increase the number of bedrooms you need or anything like that. So it's not going to have much bearing really. It's good to tell people. Otherwise, the council will say, "Oh, what you've been doing, moving someone in without our knowledge." Well, just tell them. So yeah, anyone want to add to that question at all?
No, I've often wondered whether there is some sort of, again, you use the word conservative again, notion of a household or a family, because you can add to your household or family within reason. But if you sort of, I don't know, went to a rock festival and came back with a sort of a sort of you joined a group of people that were sort of your, you know what I mean? You just, not a cult, but you sort of
Polyamorous. That's sort of like
well, not even
got
that, but there's sort of these people are they're my family in the sense that we are all of one mind, and we what's yours is mine, and we all we're basically some sort of like an old sort of Scotters household type thing where it's a commune. And would a commune constitute a household? I don't know. Well, and I can just see it not getting very far with the courts, but I would have thought it must have been tested at some point in the past.
But
So
surely it'd be
yeah,
discrimination if they didn't take it as a
exactly.
household. Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to happen very much. The big problem practically is the bigger the household gets, the harder it is to house them. So if you do occasionally get people, they sort of have a large number of children, and it's not that people are hostile to that. It's just that, if you needed a 6-bedroom property, they're not very
yeah.
easy to find. But that's a different subject. But there's nothing to stop you changing your households changing during time.
I mean, just to demonstrate what you just said there, Will. Like, I think pretty much in all cases, the average waiting time for a 4-bed is significantly longer than for a 1-bed. Just to make that point. So you're kind of better off in two beds rather than one 4-bed, and assuming your family can kind of deal with that or whatever. Sometimes like this was so Birmingham, for example, if you want a 5-bed house, you wait in 6,000 days, which is nearly 20 years, I guess. Whereas it's only 600 days for us. So it's 10% of the time basically. So yeah. Cool. Right. Well, let's call it a night there, guys. So I'm going to go off and see if I can get some Aurora. But yeah, thanks very much for your questions this week, guys. As always, just keep going on with what you're doing. Keep pushing for it. And if you've got any questions, stick them on the comment section of the channel, and we'll come to them next week. We'll be on Will's channel on Monday, so check that out as well. And other than that, I don't think I've got any other gossip. And you guys got any gossip? All quiet? Cool. All right. Well, yeah, let's leave it there for tonight. If you are going out, guys, pretty much the whole country's clear skies right now, except for Bedford, it seems. So, yeah, make the most of it, because apparently this is like the biggest display since May, which is a massive one. So, yeah, iPhones will catch it nice and easy.